And Orde, the floor is all yours on lawfare.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Professor Barrett for the invitation. My presentation, can you hear me okay?
Yeah. You might pull your mic a little bit closer.
How about this?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. My presentation will address the topic of lawfare challenges and opportunities in the gray zone. My presentation is drawn in part from my book, Lawfare, Law as a Weapon of War, which was published by Oxford University Press and is available on Amazon and elsewhere. I'll start my presentation by defining lawfare. Then I'll provide several examples, including of lawfare use by terrorist groups, by the United States, and by the People's Republic of China. Along the way, I'll provide some ideas as to how the US could more effectively be defending against and deploying lawfare. What is lawfare? Well, Major General Charles Dunlap, the US Air Force's former Deputy Judge Advocate General, coined the term a few years ago. He defined lawfare as follows. Lawfare is the strategy of using or misusing law as a substitute for traditional military means to achieve a warfighting objective. Dunlap also noted that lawfare is, quote, simply another kind of weapon, one that is produced, metaphorically speaking, by beating law books into swords, unquote. Lawfare is thus a term with neutral connotations. Just as a rifle can be used for good or for ill, so can lawfare. It's worth noting that the Chinese government has adopted a sophisticated strategy of Faluzhan, literally legal warfare, which Chinese scholars have explicitly equated with Dunlap's definition. As I discuss in my book, the Chinese government is one of two governments worldwide, which is defending and deploying lawfare much more systematically and effectively than is the United States. The other government, which I think is doing an exceptionally effective job of waging and defending against lawfare, is that of our ally Israel. Who else is waging lawfare? Lawfare is being waged today by a wide range of actors, including US, federal, state, and local governments, foreign governments, which are allied with the US, foreign governments such as China's, which are adversarial to the US, militant organizations such as the Islamic State, the Taliban, Hamas, and Hezbollah, nonviolent NGOs, and even some US private sector attorneys are doing a remarkably good job of waging lawfare. Law is becoming an increasingly powerful and prevalent weapon of war. As we'll see from my examples, lawfare, the use of law as a weapon of war, is particularly useful in the gray zone. Why is law becoming an increasingly powerful weapon of war? Well, the first is perhaps self-explanatory. There are a lot more international laws and tribunals than there were a few decades ago. The second reason why law is becoming an increasingly powerful weapon of war: non-governmental organizations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch raise awareness of international law as they interpret it, collect data, and accuse countries of violations, promote the strengthening of international laws, and sometimes instigate legal action. A third reason why law is becoming an increasingly powerful weapon of war: personal communications technology and the proliferation of online media outlets have enabled small organizations and even individuals to record and disseminate evidence, including allegations of war crimes. The fourth reason why law is becoming an increasingly powerful weapon of war: globalization and the resultant increase in economic interdependence has vastly increased the leverage of national governments, and particularly that of the United States, over other countries and their companies. My book identifies two major and interrelated variants of lawfare, which I'll describe now. They both use law to create the same or similar effects as those traditionally sought from conventional kinetic military action. One I call instrumental lawfare, the aggressive affirmative deployment of existing or new laws. This is the type of lawfare that will typically be waged by Western state actors, such as the United States, and by Western non-state actors, such as private sector litigators. Instrumental lawfare, the aggressive affirmative deployment of existing or new laws, includes, for example, Treasury's financial lawfare against Iran, and US private attorneys' litigation against Iran and other state sponsors of terrorism. These private attorneys have won and seized hundreds of millions of dollars in Iranian assets on behalf of victims of Iranian-sponsored terrorism. The other type of lawfare, which I identify in contrast, is compliance leverage disparity tactics. They usually involve the lawless, such as terrorist groups, hiding from the law-abiding, such as the West, behind existing laws. Compliance leverage disparity tactics have typically been used by terrorist states and by non-state actors. I'll give you a specific example of each of the two types of lawfare I mentioned a moment ago. And the first is instrumental lawfare, the aggressive affirmative deployment of existing or new laws. A few years ago, the US and UK identified a Russian ship, the NV Al-Aed, carrying combat helicopters to Syria. The US and UK wanted to stop the ship, but knew that boarding a Russian ship could risk World War III. The UK discovered the Russian ship was insured by a British insurer, persuaded the insurer to pull the insurance, and the ship and its deadly cargo had to return to Russia. This type of lawfare, turning a ship around without firing a shot, is eminently suitable, of course, for the American public's aversion to casualties. It's also an example, one of many, of how lawfare can be successfully deployed offensively in cases where kinetic warfare, bombs and bullets, cannot be used because it's not worth the escalation risk. The US should be undertaking, in my view, many more such uses of offensive lawfare. And how do you get there? Well, US government lawyers in the foreign policy and national security arenas need, in my view, to have their roles changed. So often, a policymaker originates and develops a potential policy step, and only then turns to his legal counsel for quote unquote clearance and asks, well, this is what we want to do. Is it legal? And if not, how can you tweak it to make it legal? To fully benefit from the power of lawfare, it seems to me the policymakers need to start turning to their lawyers at the start of the policymaking process and to ask how law can serve not as a constraint, but as a tool for achieving the policy objective. Effectiveness in offensive lawfare also requires the ability and willingness to reach out to legal experts outside of government, as offensive lawfare often requires deep expertise in such topics as maritime insurance law, where the leading experts are more likely at private law firms than in government. Okay, so the second type of lawfare. How is lawfare, and especially the second type of lawfare, being used against the US and its allies? It's important first to understand how much more seriously the US takes international law in contrast with many of our adversaries. As you may know, the US Army's Operational Law Handbook says that every soldier, sailor, airman, Marine must comply with the LOAC, and JAGs must advise commanders in US forces to follow its requirements exactly. Let's take by comparison the Chinese military's Basics of International Law for Modern Soldiers, which says, and I quote, "We should therefore always apply international laws flexibly, appealing to those aspects beneficial to our country while evading those detrimental to our interests." As one prominent Chinese writer on lawfare issues wrote, he said, quote, "War has rules, but those rules are set by the West. So do we need to fight according to your rules? No," was his answer. The US takes international law more seriously than the PRC. It also takes international law more seriously than do terrorist groups. So let's look now at a specific example, the use of human shields. Right? The use of civilians and other specially protected humans to shield otherwise lawful military objectives from attack during armed conflict is a violation of international law. It's prohibited by the Geneva Conventions. Nevertheless, terrorist use of human shields has proven to be a remarkably effective tactic against the US and its allies, whose ethical and military codes require avoiding civilian casualties. Terrorists use human shields for two main reasons. One is to cause our armed forces to self-impose restraints that would render them less effective. And two is to erode the will to fight of us and our allies, and to spur anger at us and our allies by generating civilian casualties for which the terrorists and their allies can blame our forces. Professor Dunlap, who, as I mentioned, is the father of lawfare, has written extensively about this issue. Dunlap criticized, quote, the effect of NATO's effort to impose more restrictive airstrike rules than the law of armed conflict requires, end quote, in response to the use of human shields. Dunlap said, quote, for the Taliban to survive, it's not necessary for them to build conventional air defenses. Rather, just by operating amidst civilians, they enjoy a legal sanctuary created by NATO's self-imposed restrictions that is as secure as any fortress bristling with anti-aircraft guns, end quote from Dunlap. There's a relatively recent example involving the Islamic State, which used human shields extensively against the US and its coalition partners. In August 2016, Islamic State fighters fleeing Manbij, Syria, escaped destruction by placing civilians in each of 500 vehicles in their retreating convoy. There's a photo which accompanies some articles about this, which I published online, which shows that convoy. Looks like sitting ducks, but US fighters didn't fire on the cars. US-led coalition spokesman Colonel Chris Garver said, quote, we have to treat them all as non-combatants. We didn't shoot, we kept watching, said Garver. As a result, the Islamic State fighters lived to fight and kill more civilians another day. So what can and should the US do in response to terrorist use of human shields? Well, my view is it needs to look for ways to hold the adversary accountable. And the US is seeking to do so using changes to US strategy, changes to US domestic law, working in partnership with NATO and at the UN. And I offer this as a kind of menu of the legal battlefields where lawfare can be fought. In terms of changes to US strategy, Congress a couple of years ago required the executive branch to provide a report on lessons learned by the US and its allies and actions taken by DoD to address the use of human shields by terrorist groups. In other words, Congress required the administration to develop a strategy. In terms of legislation, changing US domestic law in December 2018, both houses of Congress unanimously passed, and President Trump signed a law which requires the imposition of sanctions on various persons and entities involved with the use of human shields. In terms of NATO, March 2019, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe signed a letter to NATO member states generated by the SHAPE Legal Advisor's Office. The letter calls for further measures to be taken at the national level to maximize enforcement of the international legal prohibition of the use of human shields. And I can go into detail as to what that involves, but this is particularly important because while half of NATO member states prohibit the use of human shields in their domestic laws and military manuals, the other half do neither. Finally, action at the UN and vis-a-vis the content of international law. On June 26, 2018, thanks in part to hard work by Ambassador Nikki Haley, the UN General Assembly condemned the use of human shields in a resolution. This was the first time any General Assembly resolution had condemned the use of human shields. It did so unanimously, putting the world's governments on record as opposing the use of human shields. So those are several elements of a new multifaceted Western initiative to counter the use of human shields. I shared that case study because it seems to me that this is where the US and its allies should be taking lawfare. They need to take this kind of a sophisticated, systematic, and coordinated multifaceted approach to these issues, a kind of whole of the allied world approach, you might say. I encourage those of you in the audience to think about what other lawfare issues, what other offensive opportunities or defensive challenges merit such a sophisticated, systematic, and coordinated, multifaceted approach. But before I close and turn to Q&A, I want to focus for a few minutes on lawfare in the People's Republic of China. If some portion of warfare can be carefully shifted from kinetic combat to the legal arena, it seems to me as if that should be to the US's great advantage. While the US does have more sophisticated lethal weapons than do our adversaries, our advantage in sophisticated legal weapons has the potential to be even greater. The US is a far more law-oriented society, with a much higher percentage of its best minds going into the legal field and creatively using law to use their objectives than is, say, the People's Republic of China. Yet, as I describe in my book, China is currently waging lawfare much more diligently and systematically than is the United States. China has explicitly adopted lawfare as a major component of its strategic doctrine and is waging lawfare in several fields. It's worth noting the PRC's use of lawfare is consistent with the doctrines of both Sun Tzu and Mao Zedong. For example, Sun Tzu, the preeminent Chinese military strategist, asserted that, quote, defeating the enemy without fighting is the pinnacle of excellence. Following the Communist Revolution of 1949, China adopted the Marxist view that law serves as an instrument of politics, rather than, for example, a check on politics and an autonomous, objective arbiter of justice. Chinese law today remains an instrument of, rather than a constraint upon, state power. Consistent with the PRC's sharply instrumental use of law domestically, China engages in lawfare in several international arenas. For example, today China is actively engaged in lawfare in the maritime, aviation, space, and international organization domains. PRC strategists have emphasized that legal warfare should begin and that legal warfare is exceptionally valuable, quote, before the outbreak of physical hostilities. PRC lawfare today appears to be aimed in large part at tilting future kinetic battlegrounds to China's advantage. For example, in the maritime, aviation, and space domains, the PRC is using lawfare in relatively analogous ways to advance the same basic objective: to create, promote, and codify international legitimacy for China's expanding claims of sovereignty rights as part of its access control strategy. I predict that the PRC will become far more adept at waging lawfare over the coming decades. China's engagement with international law is a relatively new phenomenon, and it's rapidly becoming more adept. Many US companies now have significant assets located in or otherwise subject to the regulatory jurisdiction of the PRC. It would not be surprising to see the PRC explore ways of using that leverage to influence US policy towards the PRC. So what steps, and with this, I'm going to close with a short discussion of what steps could the US and its allies take now to protect themselves against future PRC lawfare? Well, for the US and its allies, it's critical to attempt to identify and prepare for the additional lawfare arenas and types of lawfare in which the PRC seems most likely to engage in the future. It seems to me such an analysis is best organized in terms of A, which specific additional lawfare arenas and types the PRC might engage in, whether or not armed conflict breaks out between the PRC and the US or its allies, and B, which specific additional lawfare arenas and types the PRC might engage in if, but only if, armed conflict breaks out between the PRC and the US or its allies. I'm going to focus here in this presentation just on A, the steps which the US and its allies should take to more effectively counter current and potential future Chinese lawfare in the gray zone. First and foremost, it seems to me the US and its allies should follow China's lead and develop and implement a sophisticated and systematic overall lawfare strategy. Then the US should develop a systematic strategy for defending against and, where appropriate, waging lawfare against the PRC. Part of this strategy should involve attacking how China uses state-sanctioned proxies to execute lawfare and other national policy behind a veil of, quote, plausible deniability. The PRC uses such proxies to implement its maritime lawfare, to conduct espionage, to steal trade secrets, and to compromise America's defense supply chain. This challenge persists in part because many Chinese decision makers remain insulated from the risk associated with current Chinese lawfare. It's therefore vital that the reach of US countermeasures, including punitive sanctions, reflect the full height of the parent entity under which Chinese proxies operate. The PRC can't be allowed to maintain ring-fenced entities that quarantine legal risk. Those at the top of the decision-making procedure must be made to reap the whirlwind of their choices. This ultimately requires a level of accountability that is cutting, credible, and comprehensive. Thus, the US needs to change the risk calculation governing Chinese lawfare. A lawfare strategy which creates a legal deterrent, plausibly aimed at both proxy and principle, could dissuade future Chinese misbehavior and raise the cost imposed on the PRC for doing so. In addition, it seems to me that the US should systematically analyze how best to take advantage of, and if possible, lengthen its current window of preeminence in shaping international law. As Professor Philip Bobbitt has put it, crafting enduring legal rules is one way the US can extend its influence beyond its temporary preeminence. In light of the rapid increase in quality and influence of the PRC's international lawyers, the US should consider how to A, take advantage of or lock in its preeminence while it still exists, and B, enhance its expertise in key areas in which the PRC improvement could tip the balance of future lawfare between the two countries. My book includes several other recommendations for how the US could better prepare to wage and defend against lawfare vis-a-vis the PRC. Be happy to discuss them in Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you, Orde. We have first question from Nels Warnimi, midshipman. You want to ask that, Nels? Are you up? I want to see what you look like. There you are.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Nels has been at like every one of these for the last 8 days. Thanks.
These conferences have been great. My question is about the fact that the U.S. Coast Guard is being deployed in greater number to the South China Sea. And so my question is that an effective, first of all, is it an act of lawfare? And second, do you consider that an effective or ineffective measure?
So that's a good question. I don't have a specific analysis for you of the deployment of the Coast Guard to the South China Sea. I know that the US has been behind China. China has been having a lot of success in the lawfare arena with regard to the 9-dash line, et cetera. Two senior US Navy attorneys, James Kraska and Brian Wilson, have warned that China continues to advance on the battlefield of international law by changing international law today so as to push US and other ships and aircraft farther away from China's coastline. China's providing its Navy more breathing room tomorrow, and that's something that you need to take a sophisticated approach to. I don't have a comment on the specifics of the Coast Guard deployment.
Yeah. Seems like they've been using the Chinese have been using their Coast Guard and even commercial vessels to wage lawfare, and we're responding to that with the Coast Guard. Yeah. Duncan. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Orde.
No, I was just going to note, I mean, one example of where China has successfully used its supposed private sector vessels was there was a case a while back of a Chinese fishing boat that was there was an incursion into Japanese waters. The Japanese seized the fishing boat captain, and the Chinese decided to push back. What they did was they quietly told all of their purportedly private exporters of rare earth minerals to Japan to just all of a sudden announce that they had decided for patriotic reasons that they were no longer going to provide rare earth minerals to Japan. This would be a violation of the WTO rules if it had been ordered by the Chinese government, but the Chinese government, used its proxies. They claimed they were private sector actors doing this voluntarily for patriotic reasons, and therefore Japan had no recourse to the World Trade Organization. This is how China uses its private sector actors.
Yeah. And that just brings out the point. It's just so interesting, the interaction between these different forms of gray zone operations that go on. Duncan McIntosh, next question to you and then to David Luban. Go ahead, Duncan.
That was a terrific presentation. Here's a concern I have. You want to outlaw human shields, but suppose some of our guys are trapped behind terrorist lines. We happen to have captured, 10 terrorists. Couldn't we'd want to put them all in Jeeps because we know they won't fire on each other. And then we make our escape. And we don't hurt anybody. We're taking these guys to jail anyway, but now they'd be up for war crimes. Our guys would be up for war crimes for doing that. Which makes me wonder, do we really want to make that illegal? And more generally, would it be part of lawfare to do this? Advocate making a lot of things illegal, and then when it's to our advantage, just break the law. Thanks.
Thank you. So the use of human shields is a violation of the Geneva Conventions already, and it's clearly prohibited by US military manuals and by US federal law. So the US doesn't do it. And so this is a situation where by stepping up enforcement of the prohibition on the use of human shields against our adversaries, we're not causing problems for ourselves. Again, it's required by the Geneva Convention. It's very clearly set forth in US law. The challenge, as I mentioned, is that only half of NATO member states have followed suit and included the prohibition on human shields use in their domestic laws, which makes it, for example, difficult for us to demand that they prosecute or extradite terrorists who engage in the use of human shields. This is particularly a challenge vis-a-vis Turkey, which is a NATO member state and does not have a prohibition on human shields use in its domestic law, and is known to harbor various terrorists who have engaged in the use of human shields. So it's a situation where we're already on the hook for this law. We might as well hold the terrorists accountable for violations of it.
Thank you. There's been a cyber attack on David Luban's hand raising. So go ahead, David.
Hi, thank you for this. I have one quick question just about the last thing that you said, but then a more substantive question. The quick question is that since Turkey is party to the Geneva Conventions, and I haven't checked whether they're party to the additional Protocol 1, but it's recognized everywhere as customary international law. The question would be, why aren't they on the hook for that? But that's not the main question that I wanted to ask. One of the things that I thought was useful about, both your presentation and General Dunlap's original article, was that lawfare is treated in a kind of even-handed way. It's something that we use, it's something adversaries use, it's something that we should use. I don't know whether you think that adversaries should use it, but in the period, let's say between 2005, 2010, lawfare accusations were almost always not in that kind of neutral way. It was always this kind of creepy, insidious thing that our adversaries did to us. So, for example, in both the 2002 and 2005 national security strategies, the United States said the use of judicial fora and terrorism, these are weapons of the weak, and they're going to challenge us. And it was pretty clear that it was the thought that we might be held accountable under international law that we considered to be something that was an insidious thing that our adversaries were doing as a weapon of the weak. There were, I was collecting innumerable op-eds accusing the ICRC of engaging in lawfare through their interpretations of the law. And I've seen articles recommending that US military lawyers should be kind of take a forward position in trying to spin interpretations of LOAC in a more friendly direction. The last example I'll give was that after the Goldstone report on Operation Cast Lead, and I think this was 2009, 2010 was when the report came out, Israel founded an organization called the Lawfare Project, which was basically saying, this is all just lawfare being done by the terrorists against us, and sponsoring very one-sided conferences to accuse terrorists of lawfare. And I'm wondering whether so that my question is about these two uses of lawfare as a kind of neutral descriptive term, the way that you and General Dunlap have used it, and the use of lawfare as a kind of accusation or pejorative term. It's what the bad guys do to us. What has become of that second usage? I mean, is it something that you reject? Is it something that has disappeared from the discourse? And just any comment that you have about that.
Sure, thanks. Good question. Yeah, I mean, I subscribe to the view of lawfare as a neutral term. I should clarify, if I haven't already, that I don't recommend that the US violate international law or adhere to international laws for the purpose of violating them and holding our adversaries accountable. But I think the US does need to take a very sophisticated approach to lawfare, to adopt a lawfare strategy. And in cases like human shields, where we can be doing a better job of holding the terrorists accountable, or in the international law arena, where the Chinese seem to be taking a much more sophisticated approach than we do, I think what's ironic to me is I don't know how many of you have ever been involved in a court case in a US domestic court. I mean, the attorneys are so aggressive in how they interpret the law, how they use motions, depositions, et cetera, et cetera. When it comes to the international arena, it seems like the US thinks that it's, the judge in every case and has to come up with the absolute sort of most fair-minded sort of approach to everything. No, be an advocate. I mean, don't violate the law, but if the other side is violating the law, point it out. If law can be changed to the US's advantage, they need to consider doing that. And I think the intellectually honest approach is to say, yeah, the use of law as a weapon of war is something we do, something the adversaries do. I think the battle, so to speak, over whether lawfare is seen as just something the bad guys do or not, I think mostly the debate has settled towards lawfare as a neutral term. I know that the NATO legal advisor, the legal advisor, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, has a very sophisticated project going on vis-a-vis lawfare. He sometimes calls it his lawfare project. More often he calls it legal operations, because lawfare does have a little bit of a sort of unsavory sort of tinge to it. But he uses either term.
Well, it just occurred to me after Nell's question that, I mean, there are a variety of ways you can prosecute lawfare. You can You can reveal and prosecute fouls. You can draw the foul and then reveal and prosecute it. You can lie about fouls. But what they're doing out in the Pacific, the Chinese they're just ignoring laws and then hope that what they're doing becomes customary law. Is that right, basically? And so then how does that work? Well, I mean, customary international law is something that's, in other words, kind of dangerous then. I mean, so one of the, I guess the things that we need to think about is making it specified instead of customary, or upholding what's already written. Yeah, I'm just kind of thinking out loud, but it seems like that notion of customary international law has been, and you know so much more about this than I do, a longstanding notion that's respected, but at the same time, it is very dangerous.
It is, yeah, and it's opinio juris. It's actions undertaken while claiming that it's the law. The Chinese are doing it. They're trying to change customary international law. I think one of the things the U.S. and its allies need to do is every time the Chinese do it, we need to say, no, that is not consistent with customary international law. Customary international law is this other thing. And to the degree that we can win victories in tribunals and such, there's a value to that. Now, the Chinese ignore sometimes what the tribunals say, but still it establishes the record. It makes it much harder for them to argue that customary international law has been changed.
Exactly, right. Joel Brown, you had a question?
Yeah, thanks. So the law of the seas, the United States hasn't ratified it. I just wanted your thoughts on, from the Air Force guy at a Naval Academy conference, your thoughts on should the United States ratify this, or would it bind us in ways that might not be productive?
Yeah, so I don't have a I don't have a specific position on that. I'm not an expert in the law of the sea, but it does seem to me that this is an example of the sort of thing that the sophisticated U.S. lawfare strategy would be taking into account. You look at, rather than just, issues come up and you say to your lawyers, well, we want to respond in the following way. Is it legal or is it not? And if it's not quite legal, how do we tweak it? Instead, you got to take a proactive approach to international law. And you got to say, look, I mean, what treaties out there, if we joined them, it would be helpful to us. What treaties out there that maybe we're a party to, we ought to be dropping out of. And what new treaties should we be proposing and trying to win support for? It's a proactive approach to international law. It's shaping international law in an intellectually honest way.
A lot of sense. Well, the last question goes to Stephen Woodside. Are you still here, Stephen?
Yes, thank you. Thanks for your talk. I appreciate it.
Sure.
I'm not sure this is the best question to end with, but I'm going to ask it since I have the floor. But it's more of a fundamental question. But so you said something like, that the U.S. ought to engage in more lawfare, right, for strategic reasons or whatnot. And I'm comfortable on that under some understandings of lawfare, less comfortable with others. And you started out with this definition of lawfare that gave me a sort of pretty good understanding of it. But I have to admit, and this is my own shortcoming, I'm sure, as the talk went on with examples and with the different parties that in the different ways they might commit lawfare, I lost a bit of understanding of what counts as lawfare. And, is lawfare or these types of lawfare, can lawfare be, simply beating over our adversary's head with, here's the law, right? This is clearly illegal. You shouldn't do this. Is it something that can be, we tweak the law or we change the law to make it to serve our strategic interests? Or is it we find ways to cut corners with the law, right? And so with those latter understandings, I'm less comfortable with your, I guess your main argument, as I took it, that this is what we ought to be doing. And I could think of one quick example where maybe this counts as lawfare, but maybe not that you're committed to all lawfare is good, but you know, the Department of Justice and the inherent interrogation, right, and the memos that were drafted up and the legal opinions to justify that policy, at least for some time. So I just wonder if you could say a bit more about maybe what counts as lawfare, or, you know, or is this a general endorsement of it?
Yeah, so again, it's the use fundamentally, right? I mean, the definition by Dunlap was lawfare is the strategy of using or misusing law as a substitute for traditional military means to achieve a warfighting objective. I do think that partly it's a mindset, right? It's, you know, okay, yes, the enemy is violating the law of armed conflict. Let's hold them accountable for it. You know, I remember asking, you know, there's a great picture which you can find online, sort of, you know, with some of my articles of that convoy, 500 vehicles through the desert, leaving Manbij, Syria, sitting ducks. The US didn't attack. And I asked some people who were sort of close to the situation, I said, well, did you figure out who gave the order for that? No, we don't track that sort of thing. You know, who in the Islamic State gave the order for it? Well, we don't track that sort of thing. Well, have you talked to, for instance, you know, your allies about, well, isn't there some, you know, some better strategy that we can take than just leaving the convoy to go on its way? You know, I remember talking to some Israeli military lawyers who were sort of puzzled by the situation. They said, well, you know, they would have, you know, dropped some nails on the road, and, you know, the first car in the convoy, their tires would have, you know, deflated, and they would have done this and that and the other. And I asked, you know, the U.S. military guy, well, what, you know, what's your strategy for dealing with the use of human shields like this? I don't know. We haven't really thought about it. Well, okay. I mean, this is why, you know, and part of Congress's motivation requiring a strategy was, you know, I went to them and told them, you know, the US needs strategy for this. In terms of tweaking the law, changing the law, I think that's part of lawfare, a sophisticated approach to changing it, to thinking about new treaties, et cetera. In terms of skirting the law, that's I don't favor that. I don't think the torture memos were a good idea. And I wouldn't favor that sort of thing. I think it's just robust, you know, using law the way you do in a domestic courtroom, robustly and aggressively, but hopefully without actually violating it.
Right. Well, thank you, Orde. That was a perfect summary, and examples too are great of lawfare, and it's look forward to. I haven't read your book yet. I apologize, but I'm going to.
No worries.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, that's the end of the conference. Thomas, are you still here? I think he's not, which is fine. I'm just going to reconfigure a little bit here. David, are you still around? I'm going to put David there as a spotlight too. David, is your camera still on?
My camera's on, and I
Oh, there
think
you
my
are.
mic should be on now.
Okay. Well, I just want to thank Orde and Thomas again, and just I want to especially thank all the people that participated in the seminar that led up to this conference over the last couple of weeks. Just an immense amount of reading and discussion, and you know, all these people in the seminar are just really responsible for the ideas and ultimately the organization of the conference. David Luban primarily, thank you, David. And Mitt Regan from Georgetown Law couldn't be here today, but he's instrumental. And then the 3 fellows at the Stockdale Center this year, Elizabeth Ratajkowski and Mark Levecki and Pierce Randall. And then Mr. Chris Bailey at the National Intelligence University has been extremely important in this initiative. And then Dr. Tony Pfaff from the Army War College. And then a couple of professors at the Naval Academy, Michael Skirker and Nathan Pippinger, political theorist. And then we had 3 midshipmen too, Quinn Alone and Sam Paparo and Laura Spratling. So it was just a great crew to work with, and I couldn't have organized a conference like this without all your input. So thank you all. And thank you for everyone for attending. There were many usual suspects over the last 2 weeks, and it was great to see you every day. And with that, I'll close the 2021 McCain Conference and pray that we see each other in person next year. Thank you.